Uh, so the first sentence, we've got adjectives before nouns, right? And we've got bright, friendly, and we've got bright, green, right? And most of you have been able to see the difference. So, of course, bright and friendly are adjectives of a similar type, right? That's why we need to separate them. Whereas here, of course, bright and green are of a different type. And also bright actually modifies green, right? So we cannot separate these. It wouldn't make sense. Unless we actually meant that the scarf was bright as well as green, right? But that's not very likely. Okay, the second one. As he read the Chekhov story, so obviously this is this starts with the subordinate clause, so we put the comma here. Dauphin Island, and we have this inserted phrase, which actually is the equivalent of a non-defining clause, because we could also say Dauphin Island, which is located off the coast of Alabama, is a favorite spot, because there should be a space here. So this obviously should be separated with commas, because it's an inserted phrase and it's an equivalent of a non-defining clause. It's extra information. Without it, we don't lose any essential information. Dauphin Island is a favorite spot for fishing. That's still correct and still the same meaning, right? This is just extra information about where this island is located. She was, as a matter of fact, mainly interested in showing off her vocabulary. Right, so again, we have an inserted phrase as a matter of fact, right? So we need commas. We need to separate this with commas on both sides. If this was at the beginning, we would have just a comma after, right? As a matter of fact, comma, she was, and so on. But this is inserted after the verb, so we need to separate it, right? Because she was mainly interested, and this is just an extra phrase. I often go to the seashore and collect rocks there, right? So we don't need any commas here, because these two activities are connected. So basically, I often go there to collect rocks. So clearly, these two are these shouldn't be separated. But the most important thing is that the subject is the same in both clauses, and it's not even repeated, right? So you only have the verb here. So there's no need at all to use the comma. Before reaching the summit, the climbers were forced by a storm to turn back. So obviously, this is put at the beginning of the sentence, right? So here is the subject. So we're putting something before the subject. This whole phrase. So we need to separate it with a comma. Did you know that James A.G., the novelist and poet, was also a film critic, right? So obviously, James A.G. was a novelist and a poet at the same time. So this is the inserted phrase. So we could remove it and still get the same meaning. Did you know that James A.G. was also a film critic, right? But here we're just adding this this extra information, and it also corresponds to a non-defining clause, because we could say James A.G., comma, who was a novelist and a poet. We would have to change this slightly. Was also a film critic, right? And here, of course, it's the novelist, because we are assuming that we just want to specify that it's that it's the novelist and poet that we mean, and not some other James A.G. So we're just making sure that the person knows who we are talking about. Okay, so we need those two commas. Lady Jane Grey was the Queen of England from July the 10th, or as Americans would say, July 10th. And actually, this is how this is the American way to write it, because in British English, if the day of the month comes after the month, we need this th here, right? So we would need this. And maybe in that situation, it would be acceptable to skip the comma, but you can see that it even looks strange, right? These numbers put together like that. So yeah, we need commas here. Okay, tomorrow, I believe, is the last day to register to vote in the November general election. So I believe is inserted here, right? Because normally we would say, I believe that tomorrow is the last day, and so on. So this is inserted, so it has to be separated with commas on both sides. Otherwise, it just doesn't work. And then the meaning is kind of unclear if you leave out either of these commas. To perform well on Saturday afternoon, comma, right? Because again, this is moved to the front, to the beginning of the sentence. This phrase, so we need to separate it. Understanding history increases your understanding of today's world. So nobody had problems with this. Of course, there are no commas. This is the subject of the sentence, right? So it's different from something like this, for example, right? Okay, so this is the subject, right? What increases your understanding? What increases your understanding of the world? Understanding history, right? But here, of course, we have this phrase which corresponds to a clause, right? Which is equivalent to a clause. So we could say, after she cut the roses, or having cut the roses, comma, she decided to bring them to her friend in the hospital. The ginkgo tree came to this country from Asia, right? This is the main clause. And this clause is the subordinate clause. And this is extra information. It's a non-defining relative clause, obviously. Because we know what we're talking about. We're talking about the ginkgo tree, right? And this is just some extra information about that tree. So this needs to be separated with commas. Okay, most of you had problems with this one. I'm assuming that that's because maybe you did not know what this means here. But this is a plural form, right? So it's a noun. So this is a list. So these are the three things that the villagers enjoyed, right? They enjoyed fairs. And if you don't know what a fair is, just look it up. Fair as a noun, right? It can't be an adjective because it's got this S, so, you know, it's not a fair festival, whatever that would be. These are fairs, festivals, and good conversation. Okay, and the next one. when the intermission was over, right? So we're starting with the subordinate clause, and of course we need to separate it from the main clause. A similar situation here. When he stumbled over your feet, William was clumsy, not rude. But we need this other comma here, right? Because we have this shift from one thing to another. He was clumsy, not rude. Okay, so she listened to her favorite record with close, careful attention, right? So we have two adjectives that are of a similar type, right? So we need to separate them with a comma. What kind of attention did she pay to the record? Okay, Gillian, who had worked in the dress shop all summer, hoped to work there again during the Christmas holidays. So we've got a name, right? So the person is defined. So this is, of course, a non-defining relative clause. So Gillian, comma, who had worked in the dress shop all summer, comma, hoped to work there again during the Christmas holidays. Right, so this is definitely a non-defining clause. Thomas Paine's pamphlet appeared in Philadelphia, comma, Pennsylvania, and probably there should be another comma, though it's not strictly necessary. But we need to separate the city from the state, right? And also, we've got a similar situation here as before. This needs to be separated because it just looks odd. This a lonely number next to another number, right? So we're separating the date from the year, basically. And here we have a question tag, which we have to separate with a comma. So I'm going to talk a little bit about used to and would, and discuss some of the examples from your sentences. So used to is used for general habits in the past, so it's more universal, right? It can be used to talk about action states, especially when we talk about like whole periods of time in our life, like in my childhood, when I was in secondary school, and so on, right? Or just without any time reference, when we just mean that we used to do something, but we no longer do that, right? We used to have that habit, or we didn't used to have a certain habit, but now we do, right? So that's the emphasis that used to gives us. Would is slightly different. So first of all, would can only be used for actions. But it's also important that we are talking about repeated regular actions. So very often it's used with some expressions of frequency, like every day or every morning or for breakfast, right? So when we specify certain times, something that happened regularly, something that was our regular habit, right? So it's not as general as used to, right? So with used to, for example, you can say, I used to play chess, and that just means that I don't play chess anymore, right? But you wouldn't just say, I would play chess without any context, right? Because would doesn't imply that something no longer happens, right? You are just talking about some habits in the past, and you are not really implying that those habits are no longer valid or that something has changed, right? Although that's probably usually the case, but that's not the focus of would. Would is good for storytelling for that reason, and that's why it was mentioned in the booklet that is often used, that's more frequently used in literature or literary texts, because it's like telling of some daily habits from the past. Especially if we, or very often, when we repeat or when we talk about a few different actions, right? Like when we describe how we would spend the day, right? So, I would get up at 6 and I would immediately run to the shower or something like that, and then we would continue with these activities. That's why these sentences here don't sound very natural without some context, right? Like I would eat a lot of pierogies when my granddad was granddad was making, because well, maybe when we talk about our childhood that would make sense, but the next one, I would spend more time with boys playing football, right? So as the comment here says, this is a bit too general. Would is normally used with specific repeated habits. Spend time is a bit vague. Play football each Saturday, for example, would be more precise. So if you said, for example, I would play football each Saturday with the boys, right? That would make more sense. So this is just too general, because you're not saying how often that happened or when that happened. Or I would go to music classes to learn how to play on the keyboard. And again, you would probably say how often or on what days, on which days of the week, right? So like I would go to music classes each Thursday, right? That would make more sense. And another one, I would watch The Lion King every day for a couple of weeks. So that again is a bit confusing. What does it mean for a couple of weeks? Because this has to be a repeated activity. So you can't say, if you say I would watch The Lion King for a couple of weeks, it means that there were several such occasions when you watched The Lion King for a couple of weeks, which means somebody watched a lot of this movie, right? Many times, like watched it for a couple of weeks, then there was a break, and then again for a couple of weeks, and so on, right? So that's what would implies, right? So if you're talking about a specific time, and it just happened once, even if that was every day, but for a couple of weeks only, then it's basically like a single event. It's repeated, but it's repeated only for a couple of weeks, right? So would is not the best form to use here. Although there is repetition, right? But it's a bit confusing because at first sight, it seems like, as I said before, for a couple of weeks is repeated, right? So that's the impression one might get, right? My family and I would go on long bike trips around Krakow, right? So again, if there was some context, that's okay, right? But there is no indication of how often or when. When I didn't get what I want, I would always complain. I suppose that's acceptable, although, yeah, it seems okay. So you could use it with always. It's not very specific, but it implies that it's a repeated activity that would happen many times, or on each occasion. Well, actually, it is kind of specified, because when I didn't get what I want, so on each such occasion, I would complain, right? So in that sense, that's correct. When I was in elementary school, I would never ask for help regarding my homework. And this is a bit, so here we also have this clause with when, but here we've got a repeated activity, right? So whenever I didn't get what I want, right? But here it's about the whole period of time, right? So when I was in elementary school, I would never ask for help regarding my homework. And the problem is, and this is explained in this paragraph here, the problem is that would is not used in the same way here. I mean, this sentence makes sense and is correct, but the meaning would be different. It would just be a conditional meaning, right? So the meaning of would that we normally use, right? So that means that I would never do it, right? It would never even occur to me, right? And also, we don't usually use would with negative forms when you want this meaning to talk about past habits, right? So this is not really about a past habit, right? Although, well, it is something that we would never do, but it's more like saying that I didn't want to, right? So you could just translate it with a conditional form in Polish as well, right? Nigdy bym nie zapytał, czy nie zapytała, right? So it wasn't an option, right? Basically, so it doesn't mean that something didn't happen, but it means that someone wouldn't do a certain thing for some reason, right? So I hope you can see the difference here. Right. Right. So when talking about past habits using would, you say what you actually did regularly, not what you never did, right? So you would say, for example, yeah, so there is a huge difference between I would get up at 6 every day and I would never get up at 6, right? So the second sentence is not the opposite of the first. It has a different meaning altogether, right? Because the first sentence, yes, the first sentence means that this was a habit in the past. It was a repeated activity in the past, and we don't really talk about the person's intentions or desires or whatever, right? We're just saying that that's what happened, right? That was my habit. That's what I would do at 6 every day. But if you say I would never get up at 6, it just means that I would never do it, right? Nigdy bym tego nie zrobił, right? So that's like saying, you know, that's not an option. I don't want to do it, right? So the meaning is quite different. Okay, so so I'm saying that maybe I'll cover this issue in a video. Yes, so this is the video. Right, so we have some more examples with used to and would. I used to go to the same beach. There's a spelling problem, and of course someone doesn't consider using spell checker because obviously the language set is different, so that's why you can't see the actual spelling errors. Yes, so I don't know why I asked this question. I mean, it's none of my business really, but yeah, but that's what it implies, right? So you have to remember that if you say I didn't used to smoke, it means you smoke now. Right, and we have some more examples with would. Yes, so again, this is too general, too vague, right? So if you say, I would sleep with the lights on, the question would be, when, how often, right? When was that? So without context, because of course you could imagine some kind of context where you say this after saying a few other things, after giving some context, right? So when I was a child, I would sleep with the lights on every night, right? And of course, it was supposed to be about childhood, but yeah. So maybe this first sentence, if we assume this context, there is no problem with that. But if you say, for example, I would watch too much TV, most likely you would use used to, because it's general, right? You're saying too much. You're not saying every evening, for example, right? So in general, too much TV. So that's not a repeated. I mean, it probably is repeated, but it doesn't really focus on this repetition. In general, too much, right? So it could be all the time, or it could be the whole weekend. We don't know, right? I would suck the thumb. So again, probably we would say I used to suck my thumb. If you wanted to use would, you would say, for example, I would suck my thumb whenever I got nervous, right? Or I would suck my thumb before breakfast, or whatever, right? I would drink a lot of juice. Again, that's just a general habit. It's not a repeated activity, right? I mean, it's not specified what it means or how often it happened. So, so with generally speaking, with expressions of quantity like much, a lot, we wouldn't use would in most situations, right? Because it's generalizing, right? It's like saying in general, right? I watched a lot of TV, or I watched TV a lot. I drank a lot of juice. So we would say I used to drink, right? Or just I drank a lot of juice when I was a child, right? But I would drink a glass of juice with every meal. That would make sense, right? Or I would chew a pen. So I would chew a pen before each exam, right? But not in general, because what does it mean? I mean when, right? If you're talking about like a very general habit, that was something that you did all the time or often, right? Without specifying the situation in which it happened, you would most likely use used to.